My number 6 best chess game of the 1940s is Sammy Reshevsky versus Arnaldo Vasconcelos from the US Open of 1944. Now, Vasconcelos was an amateur player and a Brazilian diplomat, but Reshevsky was one of the greatest chess prodigies of all time. Already at the age of 9, after immigrating from Poland to the United States, he toured the US, playing thousands in simultaneous games and losing only 8 games. It's an absolutely incredible feat. Now, later his career was a bit disjointed as he was sponsored to continue and become an accountant, and he was basically an amateur player himself after that, despite many successes, including many US championships and twice being a candidate. This game here is probably his finest attacking game. He was known for his positional play, but this game shows that he could play like Tal when the opportunity arose. Reshevsky opens the game here with pawn to e4, and Vasconcelos selects the French defense pawn to e6. As a longtime French defense player myself, I love to see the opening, but it is victories like this one by Reshevsky that do discourage one from playing it. Now we get d4, d5. Reshevsky plays the advanced variation, the most direct attacking option available to white, and now pawn c5. At this point, objectively, the only good move, the move that white should basically play by reflex here, is pawn to c3, supporting the pawn chain that is the basis for much of your play in the French defense. Instead, though, Reshevsky has a totally different idea. He captures here on c5. Now, objectively, this move is a mistake. It's a mistake that is often seen on the amateur level. However, it does have a valid idea, an idea that Reshevsky is, due to his opponent's inaccurate play, going to be able to realize in the game. The point is to get very, very active piece play, not being tied down to a weak pawn in the center of the board, and build around the strong pawn on e5 to create excellent attacking chances. The problem is that black can play good moves here, like bishop takes e5, developing and recapturing the pawn, and black is leading in development, has an extra pawn in the center of the board, and after moves like queen b6 and knight c6, there are all kinds of tender points that white is going to have to defend. I've had this position many times, and it's always gone incredibly well for me. However, in the game, Vasconcelos, spoiled with a lot of good choices, plays the move knight d7, giving up much of his advantage. Now, of course, he's obviously going to get the pawn back in a moment. He's got 3 pieces, or he's got 2 pieces attacking 2 pawns in 3 different ways in this position. But he's also committed his knight to d7, and the knight doesn't really want to be on d7. He's still going to make the capture here with the bishop because he needs to develop the bishop, which begs the question, why is the knight on d7? It could be on the c6 square instead. In the game, we see knight f3 from Reshevsky, bishop takes c5, bishop to d3, knight to e7, castles, knight to c6, bishop f4, queen c7, thinking about taking the pawn on e5, but it's always going to be too dangerous to take this pawn, so maybe the queen didn't need to go to c7. So at this point, Reshevsky misses a very strong continuation. The only strong continuation he's going to miss, because he's going to find all the other ones from here on out, that is the move pawn to c4, trying to open up the middle of the board while black's king is still in the center. Now, after pawn takes c4, if you try to capture on e5, you're in big trouble after knight takes, and then bishop to b5 check, because the problems with your knight and your queen here mean you can't block, and you must pull your king up in the middle of the board. There are all kinds of problems here for black, and in fact, Stockfish says that white is just winning, which isn't too surprising. In the game, though, Reshevsky plays the move knight c3, a good developing move. He's thinking about knight b5, and black correctly stops it. If Vasconcelos had instead decided to try to capture on e5 at this point, then there's a direct tactical refutation. Knight takes, and then knight b5. The only square the queen can pull back to is b8, and then queen h5, simply piling up on the pinned piece and winning it. You can't even play f6 because that pawn is also pinned. So in the game, we do see a6 stopping this idea of knight b5, and now rook e1, and Vasconcelos plays queen to b6. This move does attack the pawn on f2 and the pawn on b2, but it's very greedy to go after these pawns. I'm not even saying that objectively it's wrong, but you basically have to be stockfish to play like this, and most human beings are better advised to focus on their development instead of greedily grabbing pawns so late in the game with the king still in the middle of the board. Now, Reshevsky's not going to let the pawn on f2 go, so he plays bishop g3, and we do see queen takes b2. Objectively, this might even be the right move at this point, but practically speaking, it's going to be very difficult. Reshevsky now plays knight takes d5. This move is brilliant. Now, Stockfish may actually be able to defend after this, and Stockfish initially doesn't like this move, but I think that Reshevsky always has at least a draw, and practically speaking, the defense is very, very difficult for his opponent, so it is the best move, even if it's not winning by force, even if there's no actual clear advantage in this position after knight takes d5, and of course, practically speaking, Vasconcelos is very likely to succumb as he does in the game. So now we get pawn takes d5 and now pawn to e6. Actually, that move isn't played yet. Rook b1 first, which is a good move, putting the rook on an open file, which we'll see matters later in the game. And now queen to a3. You can also capture on a2, and I'm not even sure which move is better. The pawn on a2 is irrelevant in the face of the attack. The only real question is the queen better on a2 or on a3? But it's really kind of impossible to say. The queen does seem to serve some defensive purpose on a3 later in the game, so maybe this is the best move in the position. Now, pawn to e6, the knight on d7 is under attack, so you can only in this position really capture the pawn on e6 or move the knight right away. In the game, Vasconcelos moves the knight, but let's look at the pawn capture. In this position, what seems to be a convincing draw is knight g5, very dangerous, knight f6, and now rook takes e6, sacrificing another exchange in this position and threatening moves like knight to c7 and rook takes b7 and knight takes g7. At this point, after king f7, rook takes, and then bishop e7, it looks like the best available is a draw after knight g5 check, and then the queen can go to e1. This is a threat of mate here, and so the king needs to move over, but after the king moves over, the knight can check, and the knight can shuffle between g5 and e6, while the king shuffles between f8 and g8. It is a draw by perpetual. So, in the game, we see knight f6 instead, and now pawn takes f7, king takes f7, and an excellent move by Reshevsky, bishop to h4. The bishop no longer served a function over here, and it now intends to capture the knight on f6, which is the most important defender of the king. And in capturing the knight on f6, white will start to gain access to the critical light squares that will decide this game. At this point, all of the natural moves don't really work for black. For example, rook to e8 allows knight g5 check, and then after the king pulls back and tries to defend this rook, there's knight takes h7 check. After knight takes h7, you don't even capture here or on e8. Instead, you play queen f3 check, and it's murder on the f and e files. White is basically just mating in this position. Very beautiful stuff. The best defense, according to the engine, is the very complicated king to g8. I basically think that no human would play this move because you're entombing your rook on h8 and you're basically not doing anything to improve your position. Why would you ever do this move? But it does get out of checks and seems to just work. Sometimes computer moves just work. At this point, the best I've found is a draw by perpetual after c4, d4, you trade now on f6, damaging the pawn structure defending the black king, and knight takes d4 to open up lines for the queen to come into the game. After knight takes d4, there is rook e8 check, and after the king moves up to g7, you want to play queen g4 check, but you cannot yet, so you have rook takes b7. The bishop is trying to defend the 7th rank and trying to defend the g4 square. It cannot do both tasks. After bishop takes, there is queen g4 check. White has a draw now by shuffling between g4 and h5, but white does not have more than this draw. In the game, though, not finding this very difficult computer defense, Vasconcelos plays the losing move. He plays knight to b4. I guess when none of the natural moves work, it's not that surprising that black would try a move like this, at least trying to trade off one important attacking piece for white, but naturally this move is too slow and it does lose the game. Knight e5 check, this square was left open by the maneuver of the knight to b4. King back to f8, bishop takes f6, trying to damage the pawn structure around the king. If the bishop is captured, the queen jumps into the action, threatening mate right here. If the knight is captured, then queen takes is hitting the rook here on g8 or on h8, and if you move it to g8, there's queen f6 and checkmate. Very, very pretty checkmate. So in the game, instead of capturing here on f6, black tries to eliminate the light squared bishop first with knight takes d3. But this leads to a beautiful finish from Reshevsky. First, bishop takes g7 check. King takes g7. If you don't capture the bishop, then the bishop is still hanging. White can now capture on d3 and still has all the same attacks and equal material. Capturing the bishop on the next turn will not help you in any way. So now, what should white play? We've actually already seen the critical idea. This bishop here on b7 is overworked. It's trying to defend this pawn and the square, and it cannot do it, so rook takes b7 check. A beautiful, beautiful sacrifice. If the bishop captures the rook here on b7, there is queen g4 check. All roads lead to forced mates, but there are many ways to get there. I'm just going to give one mating continuation. King f6, queen h4 check. If the king tries to zigzag over this way, it's always the case that the queen will come to d7 in some way and mate the king. So the king's going to try to stay on the king side in this variation. Queen h5 check, king f6, queen into f7 check, king g5, knight f3 check, and we finish with pawn to h3 and checkmate. In the game, Vasconcelos does not capture the rook here on b7, instead playing bishop e7, trying to pull a piece back to defend. This doesn't help much though, and the finish is still beautiful. We get queen h5, threatening queen f7 among many other moves, and now rook over to f8, trying to develop the rook and defend that square. Queen g5 check, because the bishop is pinned by the rook that has not been captured on the 7th rank. King back to h8, and everything is happening with forcing moves. Knight to g6 check, eliminating that last pawn that is trying to defend the king. Pawn takes, queen h6 check, queen takes g6 check, and then you simply capture on e7, and the threats here of mate on both g7 and on h7 with the queen or the rook are simply too much. Stockfish says that the most black can do is delay mate by 3 moves. As a result, Vasconcelos resigned in this position. I hope that you've enjoyed this scintillating attacking game by Reshevsky. I definitely think it is his best attacking game. If you want to see more of my best chess games of the 1940s, then simply click on that playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.